David Barry, welcome to the Tailwind Podcast. It's an honor to have you on here.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor to appear on the podcast.
So we're going to talk about your new book, your first novel. Congratulations on it, by the way.
Thank you very much.
It's called Formula, and I would describe it as a coming-of-age story of post-college kids living in San Francisco, figuring out who they are, what they want to do in life. How would you describe it?
That is a great description of it. It's very hard for me to describe. I think with a novel, it's much harder to describe in some senses than with a nonfiction book. There isn't one essential idea that the book tries to develop. I think with novels like Pride and Prejudice, War and Peace, Crime and Punishment, as their titles indicate, there is an essential idea that runs through the novel. But I don't think that's necessarily always true. And a novel can be doing many things at once. It can be a work of history, of philosophy, of drama, all at the same time. I think in the case of my novel, one thing you point out, Andrew, that I think is true is that there is a protagonist who has his own aims and ambitions and background and interests, but then he has three friends. So in the description, I call them the priest, the poet, and the buffoon, but those are reductive characterizations of those characters. And like you said the other day, some of them break the mold or the stereotype that their character is supposed to represent some of the time. But I would say that, yes, it's a coming of age story in the sense that the characters are all very young. They've graduated from college. They're in their 20s and their whole lives are ahead of them. And so you don't know, it's not like they have families or they have responsibilities. So in my opinion, that gives it a kind of an excitement because the possibilities are endless. And I definitely identify with the term of romanticism for the genre of the novel. I think you could characterize it under many things, but I think romanticism is apt in the sense that, in contradistinction to, say, classicism, whose values are order and proportion and symmetry, romanticism tends to favor intense depictions of life and emotion and a high pitch of intensity, and also favoring the inner world and the experience of the individual over, say, taking more of an objective view as the narrator. Like, as you probably noticed, the narrator definitely has opinions and definitely exercises somewhat of an influence on the way that the reader receives the information of the story. Whereas other styles of narrative, the narrator is very self-effacing and just gives you the action and the dialogue and doesn't have much to say about it.
Totally. Yeah, I love that about it. And you brought up the protagonist, Timothy, and his group of friends. So he essentially works for a big tech company, but he is attracted to other careers, in particular music and specifically rap. Is that something that was that dynamic where he works in tech, but he's attracted to the arts? Is that something you put in the book because it was personal to you, or is that a dynamic you see in San Francisco, or some combination of both?
I think more so it's specific to me in my experience, but I think that on the other hand, and I don't know how common it is necessarily in San Francisco, but I think it's also a universal thing. I think all people have some sensitivity to art and maybe desire to create art. In the case of Timothy, I think I personally have found rap as a genre to be the most exciting for the past 10 years or so. And I think within rap, a lot of the things in music that I loved about music in the 90s and early 2000s has started to be absorbed within the genre of rap. And all that really means is rather than a band, you have an instrumental. But the form that instrumental takes can either create a situation where someone's speaking rhymes very fast with very little melody or singing, or it can, as it has done recently in the past 5 to 10 years, you have this sort of rock chorus and other forms of singing and expression endemic typically to rock music. You have them cropping up in rap music. So, for instance, I have an interest in this, and I've dedicated the book to Lil Peep because I conceive of him to be almost the last vestige of poetry in some sense for people our age. Like, we know very little people who write poetry or print poetry,
right.
But with popular music, yes, there is the background of music, but what great musicians can do is elevate it to the level of poetry. And I think it's interesting because I began my career at Google. And so in some ways, the experience of Timothy is very loosely derived from some experience I had when I was at Google. And I was, as Timothy is, involved with the Google Talks program. So already I was kind of yearning to be a writer, probably more than to stay at Google for a really long time.
Yeah. One of the things I like about the story is that there are a lot of fictional stories out there of like post-college kids living in major cities, New York, LA, navigating life and like figuring out what they want to do. But typically with stories set in the Bay Area, it's usually about these like tech whiz kids, like the show Silicon Valley, where it centers on basically like computer science PhDs starting a company. Formula to me, it depicts San Francisco, really where a large majority of the people here work in tech, yes, but like they're still young and figuring out what they want to do. And they got a job in tech after college and moved to San Francisco because it was like one of the things to do when you were finishing up college. It's like, oh, I could go work for Google. So is that, I don't know, like there's not even as much of a question there. I just thought it was like refreshing to see that depiction of San Francisco.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think the book is very much, I try to make it imaginative, and it's definitely a work of realism. It's kind of like trying to be faithful to the experience of life. But then also I try to weave in more imaginative elements. Like, for instance, his three friends, one of them is an artist, and that's pretty uncommon, I think, in San Francisco, at least today. I'm sure they're out there. But then his other friends, one of them runs a choir. Again, something that is pretty uncommon. But I think in these things, I like it about them that they're uncommon. And I think the point of art can sometimes be to take you to an exotic, unfamiliar place. So a big early mentor of mine was Aldous Huxley, whose early novels, not Brave New World and the later ones, which I haven't read, but his early social comedies like Chrome Yellow and Antic Hay were big influences on me because the world that he creates is larger than life. And there's a scientist character, there's a poet character, there's a painter character, and he is able to share what he loves about all these various aspects of life and interests that he has with the reader, either through having his characters talk about it or having, in the way that, say, Marcel Proust does, having the narrator just give you his critical analysis of things or his exposition of certain opinions or theories. So for me, I am interested, yes, in fiction, but I'm interested also in poetry and philosophy. So you'll find like the narrator sometimes goes on digressions, philosophizing about things or trying to convey, like, one thing I really sympathize with that Oscar Wilde said is that art is the criticism of life. And so for me, that means that I am trying to convey to you the things that I think are beautiful about life, or I'm trying to convey an experience through a story that someone perceiving it can conceive of as being beautiful.
So with Timothy, so he works in tech, and he's sort of going on a number of different quests simultaneously. He's trying to make a career in rap where he's essentially starting to manage a rapper. He's trying to join a social club, and there's a girl he likes. And he's going on these quests. Do you think readers are going to be rooting for Timothy as they're reading the book?
Yeah. So I try not to make it black and white. I think that his desires are pretty universal. You know that he works at a prestigious company, but his job itself is not very dignified, I guess. And you know that his friends, like one of his friends is the son of the mayor. One of his friends is involved with the ownership of the basketball team. So you know that his friends are coming from backgrounds of, say, power. And you know that he's kind of moving in this world, but for some reason, he's still saddled with this job that he doesn't think is appropriate or worthy of him. And so over the course of the book, he is using his social connections and the relationships he already has to try and short circuit his way to the life that he wants in a very short amount of time. And so in order to do that, he decides to make several moral transgressions. but they're transgressions that I think in the moment as the reader, you're taken aback by and maybe a bit shocked by. But I think because he is sympathetic in other ways, I would hope that you still want him to flourish in the way that he desires, because he wants it bad enough that he's willing to take these great risks. And I think that desire for a better life is something that anyone can really sympathize with. Of course, you have to draw the line over moral transgressions. And I think Timothy is interesting because he's kind of this gray character. He's the protagonist, but one of his friends, who's much more concerned with morality, is meant to show that it is possible to be much better than he is. But in the context of drama and in fiction, it's more interesting maybe to try and focus more on the gray areas.
In terms of his friends, one of the things I liked about the way you show their dynamic, like just the dynamic of their friend group, is that, like, yes, they each have their own kind of like personalities and values and instincts, but you can see that as a friend group, like they each influence each other and they kind of move each other a little bit like away from some of their core instincts, which again, I think is just a much more like realistic way to depict a friend group, as opposed to having these like very static characters that just always say the exact thing that you would expect them to say.
Mm-hmm.
Was that intentional? Was that something you went into the book being like, I want to be a little bit more realistic about how a friend group operates?
I think I really want it to be the approach to the characterization to be idealist. And by that, I mean that they are supposed to represent certain ideals. But I think what you're describing is the way the characters influence each other. And I think I definitely made it a priority that they influence Timothy. So you'll find that the wholesome character, the kind of pious priest character, is always trying to make him better or convince him to do the right thing or to spend his time in the right way. Whereas the buffoon character is the one who has good intentions towards him, but his approach is such that it ends up getting him into trouble. And whereas the third character, Colin Byron, who's the romantic, he's the artist, and he's always falling in love. He represents kind of, whereas Timothy's only dipping his foot in the water with respect to art, he's advising an artist now. Colin Byron has taken the full leap of faith and is putting himself out there with his art. So I think they are all pulling him in those respective directions towards themselves. But yeah, as a group of friends, I think it's really great that they've maybe grown away from each other since the time they first became friends, and they've each developed in their own direction, but still they're best friends. And I think that that's a beautiful idea. And it is like the things about Frank Alston, even though he's much more mature now and he's supposedly overcome those types of things, he still, almost in spite of himself, harbors a tenderness towards it because he was once that way. And maybe he just still sees some of himself in Frank. So yeah, I definitely try to make the other characters rub off on each other as well, but that's less of, I think, a conscious intention than how they influence the main character.
I loved that aspect of the book. In terms of San Francisco, so I think Formula shows an interesting dynamic about the city where there are basically several different cultures that are coexisting. Maybe sometimes there's a little bit of a culture clash, but I just sort of think of it as like these different cultures coexisting. You've got tech, it's maybe small tech with like 5 people in an apartment coding up something, big tech and like extreme wealth, art. And then also something that I think is maybe underappreciated in terms of like depictions of San Francisco is like this old America. And you depict that through these social clubs that Timothy's one that he's trying to join. And I don't know, I think you nailed it. Just the different cultures that coexist here. And Timothy is sort of caught, he interacts with all of them in different ways. So is that something you were trying to show?
I think that's part of the novel. I think in the Victorian period, for instance, Thackeray, a lot of his novels are set in club or partially set in club settings, or Anthony Trollope. And I think I always found that to be beautiful. Like, I think when you have a work of fiction that is depicting various types of institutions, or for instance, in Balzac's novels, he depicts the way the press would operate and how it was kind of tethered to politics at the end of the century, 19th century in France. And whenever books treat of institutions, for some reason, that makes like the fabric of the world feel richer, in my opinion. So for instance, with the yacht clubs and their rivalry. I think some of that, it's obviously a lot more extreme than that kind of thing would ever be in real life. There with fraternities in college, they have rivalries, and I think not as much nowadays, but maybe a decade or two ago, they would do pranks and would make it into this fun kind of almost childish warfare, I guess you could say, pseudo warfare between the two institutions. So there was something about that from our fraternity experience that I definitely tried to weave in.
One of the settings we haven't touched on yet is the Wolves, which is the professional basketball team in the city. They're named the Wolves in the book. And there are some core scenes that take place basically like in the arena. I don't know. To me, again, maybe I was sort of projecting onto this or reading too much into it, but I thought like the Wolves arena or like the pro basketball arena here is where all those cultures come together. Like that's like the one area, the one building where all of the different cultures in San Francisco or even like the Bay Area more broadly will all kind of like be together aligned on something. Was that at all part of like you're choosing to set some scenes there? Was that part of it? It was like, this is where we can get everyone together?
I think it was the place where Timothy was to conceive the idea for his business, and a basketball place you can easily conceive of musicians sitting on the floor. And I think it's also the aspect about, especially a basketball arena where it's a pretty small space with a large stadium built around it, and all the attention and all the light is in that one area. So the fact that from the very outset, it seems like there's this great world and that the characters are kind of at the center of that world, like the center of attention. And I think and a lot of the book is set either at the club or at the stadium or at basically the fictional castle in San Francisco that Alston Warendite's family lives in. So all those places seem like they're places that were the center of attention, where important things are happening, important alliances being formed, important decisions being made. And I think one thing, I love the novels of Benjamin Disraeli because I think he kind of unabashedly tries to make them like that, like set in these dreamy environments that seem like almost like fairy tales.
There definitely is like the way that the narrator talks about, especially like in the beginning when everyone's sort of like milling about basically around the court. The narrator talks about it's like kind of narrates it in such a way that you know it's so clear who's talking to who and who's walking over to who. And you're right, it would be totally clear if you were in the stadium because everyone's focused on that one spot. And it makes like the approaches that happen in that scene that much more significant because you know whoever is deciding to approach someone else knows that everyone can see that happen.
Yeah, it gives it a sort of theatric quality or like a cinematic quality that it heightens the drama of even something so simple as like getting up and walking across the court.
Yeah.
And yeah, like coming back to what you said earlier, the fact that you can weave in the press. So the institution of the press and the two respective opinions coming from the press, and also the sort of parts of my own experience in life I felt maybe preyed upon by the press. And so I definitely could not help but convey some aspect of that because it feels true to me. But yeah, I love how the press is kind of always in the background of the story, coming in and out. But yeah, the basketball game gives a pretext for involving the press early on, getting them as part of the world. And then also, yeah, it's not very much spelled out in the first chapter, but the sports are also very related to the art that Colin's producing, at least in the beginning of the novel.
Yeah, yeah. I asked about, do you think people are going to be rooting for Timothy? I guess to flip that, is there anything, any person or group of people or even just like an institution that you think readers will be sort of rooting against throughout the novel?
I try to make everything lovable, like even the villain. I like some of the passages about the villain, you know, who loves going to nightclubs and that kind of thing. Timothy's nemesis, Hickson Bingham. Some of those are my favorite passages in the book because I try to make, even if I'm trying to ridicule something or convey the cruelty of someone, another passage like the passages about Vivian Byron and her snobbishness towards Thomasin Perrin, who's the subject of Colin Byron's passion. I'm depicting something that is not very good and not very morally good, but I try to do it in a way that kind of is amusing or kind of at least tries to extract some kind of beauty from it. If it's only, say, like in the force of the language that's used to describe it. So I don't want anyone coming away with a distaste unless it's a distaste for me. I think, I try to make everyone lovable. And Timothy, like he definitely meets with somewhat of a tragic fate. But I think that way of ending it feels the most powerful and intense, which is ultimately my goal. Another thing I enjoyed is you slipped in some descriptions of things that are, I think, relatable for a lot of friend groups. And specifically, I think, things that our friend group, like you talk about basically a version of Super Smash Brothers. Like Timothy's, like they play Smash. Yeah. You also talk about how nicknames like evolve to the point where whatever like the sort of present version of the nickname is, there's no trace of what the original nickname was. Like in it, it's like evolved to like the 6th degree. Right. Was that just like things that you slipped in there because it's like things and was it like enjoyable to put in there, or was there any deeper meaning of like including things like that? I think that's coming back to art being a criticism of life, and I want to tell you my secrets and my wisdom, and I think that I wanted them to have their own language. Because that's something that just naturally happens when you spend a lot of time with people, especially when you're young. And I wanted to depict that as an aspect of life, just in the way that Super Smash Brothers is the greatest video game, at least for people in our generation, because there's just something about it that games like Madden or NHL just can't give you. Yeah. It seems like it's more imaginative. Like all the Nintendo characters feel like they're from stories or like mythology, which I think gives it this other character that makes it to such a point that I could spend like 2 pages describing it. And I think it's just, for me, like there's so many fond memories from having huge groups doing that and playing that. And it has such a cult following, like it always had, and so much study and criticism goes into it. And so, I think there's an interesting comic tension. So like, for instance, what you're saying about the development of slang amongst friend groups, and also kind of the analysis of the physics of pool basketball. Like those things are obviously kind of juvenile things to spend much time talking about. But I think if you approach anything with the right mindset, just thought and trying to convey it in thought, that you can elevate things that might seem childish on the surface. And by talking about them, you can talk about things even beyond the things that you may ostensibly be talking about. Yeah. So even like, for instance, it's like, yes, pool basketball, it's something very childish to even have in the book. But on the other hand, like the way that you can talk about, I feel like I don't really have much about science in the book, and that's a failure of mine. Aldous Huxley does a good job of that. I don't know how much sometimes when Aldous Huxley does it, I think with Eva Lenoir that it can get ugly. And I think sometimes the failings of works of science fiction or futurism feel sometimes ugly because of the science, in my opinion, is overbearing. But I try to talk a little bit about botany, and I think that pool basketball is a way of trying to at least convey some notion of physics, because I want it to be larger than life, and I want to try and convey everything, at least give everything its place to a certain point. So Timothy, he goes down into as he's pursuing his music career, I think at one point he sort of, he finds himself in a situation where he's like, okay, we're not in Kansas anymore, so to speak. And that's the shooting that he's sort of close by for. What was your intention with that? Like to include a scene like that raises the plot development from like, these are a bunch of just kind of young tech kids in San Francisco navigating life to like, oh, this just got very real and like life threatening. Curious to hear your thoughts on like, I want to include a scene, like I want to raise people's blood pressure to that point. Yeah, I think once you've chosen a theme and a subject of treatment, you kind of have to just imagine where it would go. And I think, although I have no experience of being shot at, I think that once I chose that for my theme, it's something that presented itself as a direction things could take. And I allowed it, I yielded to it and saw where it went. And I think it happens very fast. I don't try and convey to you much the experience of being shot at. I just kind of have the narrator breeze through it. But I think it does lead in the later parts of part 3 to some of his most profound reflections upon metaphysical truth. And, he starts to think, I haven't seen this done in a novel before, but he starts to think about how to conceive of what he thought was a miracle that had just happened in his survival.
Yeah.
And what that meant about, how he chose to perceive reality.
To me, it was sort of like representative of the pushback that the universe gives people who try to really, sometimes really carve out their own path and go chase their dreams independent of the mainstream and the crowd. And like that, to me, it crystallized that pushback that people get when they go and try to carve their own path. Sometimes it was like crystallized in that scene.
That's great. That's a great allegorical interpretation. I hadn't conceived of that in the writing of it, but I think that's one of the best things about art is that the artist himself is not his best critic some of the time, or necessarily a great critic. I think that being a critic and being an artist are very much go hand in hand. But I love about art that you just pointed out to me something that I don't think I consciously anyway had in mind when I was writing the book.
Yeah. What haven't I asked?
I've received questions about the fleur-de-lis on the spine, and I think that's something that I think would look good. First and foremost, I like the way that it kind of springs out of the title, almost like a tree or a flower.
Yeah.
I like how there are 3 petals and the book is 3 parts. And there are a lot of branchings into 3s in the book. He has 3 friends. For the girls, we haven't talked much about the girls, but the girls, there are 3. There is his love interest, which is separate, but then there are the 3 girl group where you have the girlfriend of Alston. And I try to depict someone like Alston, like what troubles his relationship might be suffering from. You have Belle Alamer, who's an influencer. She's probably my favorite. And in part 2, she and Timothy have some great conversations about social media, about being an influencer. And I think, again, like I'm trying to weave in some sort of philosophical analysis or historical analysis. So she gives me a pretext to talk about the ideas of Martin Heidegger on technology and some of the thinking of it metaphysically and how it influences our lives. So he was very much an inspiration for some of those passages about how with social media, it feels sometimes like our lives or our social lives have become the backdrop, are serving as a means to, create these presentations of ourselves online. And when you prioritize the online presentation of yourself over the social event that you're at in the moment, that can have an alienating effect on the other people at that social event, because it doesn't seem like you're there and to socialize, but there to seem like you're socializing or something with your followers online. And so what starts as something like this cool new feature about life almost starts to come at the expense of other things that you didn't realize you were losing those things when this new convenience was given you. But it's only later that, like, for instance, when people would write letters, you could have a long grace period to reply. But now that, people are using text all the time, you're much more beholden to, the turnaround time for texting, and the expectation is much, much faster than it ever was with post.
Yeah. You mentioned a couple author mentors that you look up to and have influenced your writing. Is there anyone else you haven't touched on yet you'd want to call out as particularly influential?
Yeah. So when I first got into reading novels in my mid-20s, I was probably most affected by Evelyn Waugh and Kingsley Amis, who were 20th century British satirist comic novelists. Evelyn Waugh wrote Brideshead Revisited, which I think is a great masterpiece. And I've read probably half of all his books. His last book, The Ordeal of Gilbert Pinfold, is really funny. But his first book, Decline and Fall, as well as Put Out More Flags, is another great book of his. He writes in a way that the prose is very pretty, but he's much more of a minimalist. So he it's a very fast moving. There's a lot of dialogue, and his sense of humor is really unique. And I think he was influential over me in the same way that my story, it's trying to be realism, definitely, but it does lapse into farce in places. And I think he does that really well. The other one of my early mentors is Kingsley Amis, who wrote Lucky Jim, which I think, it's been a long time since I read it, but it made such a great impression on me when I first read it. Never have I laughed so hard. And it also made me cry, the part when Jim Dixon tries his luck. But the way that my book is titled Formula, and you don't really understand why it's titled that until one of the last few pages.
Yeah.
That comes from Lucky Jim, where all of a sudden why the book is called Lucky Jim, and that sort of click in the mind of the reader I found very pleasing when I read Lucky Jim. So I wanted to create that also in my book. And another influence definitely would be remiss not to mention Oscar Wilde's Picture of Dorian Gray, because I think the last sentence, the way that you don't really know everything until the last word, and the last sentence is really long and dramatic and kind of leaves you with this image, that I tried to do with the last sentence in my book. And that's one of the things I knew the book was done when I had written the last sentence. And then I kind of had to go back and fill in some of the other stuff and develop it and refine it. But I'm very happy with the last sentence and the way that the book ends. And I think I've mentioned Balzac and Tolstoy and Proust as people who influenced my narrative style. And I just think finally, the person that I most sympathize with and admire is probably Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who was one of the founders of the Romantic movement in England in the very beginning of the 19th century. He and William Wordsworth published lyrical ballads at the very end of the 1700s in England. But it's really through Coleridge's conversational poems, a lot of his poetry, which is what he did in the first phase of his life. But then he became a philosopher, a literary critic, and a theologian. And so the way that he, in different phases of his life, made his contribution to these all very important and what I find to be interesting fields, I conceive of him to be both an intellectual mentor in that a lot of what he finds interesting, I find interesting, and I almost yield to him to show me things that I will like. And I just have always felt when I read his books, this very close personal sympathy with him. And I actually found that he's in 772 was born the day before me on October 21. Not saying that has something to do with it, but it's an interesting coincidence. One of the things that helped me to finish this book, obviously, I think I write in a way that's somewhat idiosyncratic, and you could call it archaic. And I think for a long time, I was embarrassed about that. And I think one of the things that made me able to finish the book was accepting about myself that at least at this point in my life, I'm a romantic, and I identify with high pitch of emotion in my prose in a kind of intensity, almost like an epic quality to it. I can only really get away with that because the book is also farcical and funny. Like if it were just straight faced like that the whole time, it would probably be too intense and maybe even ridiculous. But yeah, I think it is it's probably funny in certain places, but I think on the whole, I think of the book as a serious work of kind of expression of yearning for something more. That's why everything Timothy's going for, it's almost like unattainable. And he's almost having to create, like in his mind, ways of getting there. And one of the things about romanticism, I think one image that really conveys it is from a short story of Balzac's, where there is a musician who was kind of a respected musician earlier in his life. And I think someone goes to look him up or to see him, and he's living in a garret in abject poverty, his family's starving, and he's just furiously at work on some magnum opus. And ultimately it's been a while since I read the story, but the gist of it is that no one really understands what he's doing but him. And very few people can derive pleasure from what he's doing but him. But romanticism is the idea that he has trust that if it's meaningful for him, that will be universal, or that even though there's no one immediately around him who's confirming him, he still has trust that what he thinks is important and true and beautiful ultimately will be recognized. And I think for me, because the way that I have approached writing the novel, I sent it out to agents like 9 months ago, a year ago. And the feedback I got was basically that they don't see it selling very much. And I don't blame them. I think if you're hopeful about people understanding it and enjoying it, I think it will sell. But I think what I really love about romanticism, the reason I identify with it is because I've received very little external validation from institutions or people who typically deal in the sphere of books and the book trade. And so I like the idea that it could be a while before people really catch on to what I think I accomplished with the book.
It's interesting that now that you say that, now that I think about a lot of the characters, they are sort of like pursuing their own, I guess, like romantic journeys in a way. I mean, Colin Byron doing art, Timothy obviously like just kind of pursuing his own interest. There is something romantic about a lot of, I guess, just like sort of interests in the book or like in the story. I interpreted that as just like independence when I was reading it, but I think it sounds like there's an element of like of romanticism in there too.
And even in the character, like Colin Byron is professedly the romantic character, but even characters like Clara Tillotson, she starts her career as an investment banker and then has become an entrepreneur. That's something that is much more conceivable in San Francisco today. Like there are a lot more people doing that than doing, say, what Colin Byron's doing.
Right.
But even that, like the decision to go from the one career to the other is a risk. And, whenever you're taking a sort of risk or a leap of faith on what you know and your judgment, you have enough conviction in that to do it without receiving any support from anyone else. That is itself a lot of what I conceive of romanticism to be. So even with her, who's in a much more, you could say, conventional path, I'm trying to elevate it and show what I find to be admirable qualities of someone on that path.
Dave, I think that's a good place to leave it, unless there's anything else you want to put on the record.
I would love to put on the record that I'm grateful to appear on the podcast, and it's been a pleasure talking with you. I learned new things about the book being here, and I look forward to having more conversations, at least off the air, if not on the air again.
Of course. Yeah, same here. Thanks for coming on. David Barry, author of Formula. It's been a pleasure. And yeah, man, we'll talk soon.
Sounds good. Thanks, Andrew.